The second my husband stepped through our front door with that sunburn on his face and a cheap airport coffee in his hand, I looked him in the eye and asked, "Angela has HIV. Did you know?" The color drained from his face so fast I honestly thought he might faint. He didn't ask why I said it. He didn't ask if I was serious. He grabbed his truck keys, muttered, "I'll be back," and drove away so fast the garage door was still closing when he backed into the street. That was the moment I knew. Not because of any medical diagnosis. Because an innocent man would have asked questions. A guilty one already had the answers he was afraid of. My name is Rebecca Collins. I'm 42 years old, and until that afternoon in June of 2024, I believed I had a marriage most people would have called ordinary. We lived in Carmel, Indiana, in a quiet subdivision where everyone waved while walking their dogs and complained about the same potholes every spring. David and I had been married for 18 years. No children. Just us. That wasn't by choice. We'd tried for years, and eventually life settled into a rhythm that hurt a little less each season. We built routines instead. Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, Friday dinners at a little Italian restaurant downtown, Sunday afternoons watching the Colts, whether they were winning or embarrassing themselves. I worked as a librarian at Creekside Middle School. I loved it. Kids always told you exactly what they thought, even when you didn't ask. David managed commercial construction projects. His job often took him across Indiana, sometimes into Illinois or Ohio. Business trips weren't unusual, so when he told me he had to attend a 15-day construction management conference outside Phoenix, I barely questioned it. Angela Morris stopped by that same evening. Angela had been my best friend since sophomore year of high school. She knew every version of me. She knew who I dated before David. She held my hand after my mother's funeral. She even stood beside me as my maid of honor on our wedding day. "I'm heading to Arizona, too," she said, while helping herself to iced tea from my refrigerator. "Women's wellness retreat, yoga, hiking, no phones. I'm probably going to come back talking about crystals." I laughed. "You yoga? I know, it'll last about 10 minutes. We hugged goodbye. Neither of us had any idea that would be the last honest conversation we'd ever have. Or maybe only I didn't know. David left early Monday morning. Angela flew out that afternoon. The house became painfully quiet. At first, everything seemed normal. David texted every evening. "Miss you. Conference food is terrible. Can't wait to sleep in my own bed." Angela barely texted, which fit perfectly with her story about disconnecting from technology. Then everything changed on day 4. I was eating lunch in the school library, scrolling through Facebook, while 6th graders argued over whose turn it was to check out graphic novels. One of my former students had posted vacation pictures from Phoenix. Most of the photos were harmless. Cactus, mountains, airport. Then I froze. In the background of one picture walking toward a rental car shuttle were David and Angela. Together. She was laughing. He had his hand resting lightly against the middle of her back. It wasn't proof of an affair. Not yet. Friends could travel together. Coincidences happened. But something inside me shifted. That evening, I enlarged the photo until it became grainy. Same suitcase David packed. Same baseball cap. Same white sneakers Angela always wore because she said they made her feet look smaller. I didn't call either of them. Instead, I waited. The next morning, I logged into our joint credit card account. David had forgotten I could still see transactions. There it was. 1 hotel in Scottsdale. 1 room. Not 2 reservations. 1. I stared at the screen for nearly 10 minutes before closing the laptop. I wanted there to be another explanation. Maybe separate rooms billed together. Maybe a company discount. Maybe. There are 1,000 maybes when you're trying to protect your heart. Over the next several days, I quietly collected information. Nothing dramatic. No spying through windows. No chasing anyone. Just facts. Restaurant charges. Spa expenses. Gas purchases. The same locations appearing on both David's and Angela's social media stories, even though they carefully avoided photographing each other. One afternoon, my neighbor Linda stopped while I watered the flowers. "Quiet around here," she smiled. "David's away." "Oh, that's right. Arizona." I forced a smile. "Business." She waved and continued walking her golden retriever. I remember thinking how strange it felt to lie for someone who was almost certainly lying to me. At night, sleep became impossible. Sometimes I'd stand in the kitchen at 2 a.m. drinking cold water straight from the faucet. Other nights, I'd sit on the back porch listening to sprinklers start across the neighborhood. I kept asking myself the same question. Do I confront him now? Or do I wait? Every instinct told me to call, to scream, to demand answers. Instead, I waited because angry people make mistakes. Calm people notice them. Around day 11, I remembered something Angela had mentioned months earlier. We'd been having coffee at Rosie's place downtown when she'd casually said, "My doctor wants to run some more blood work, probably nothing." I asked if everything was okay. She shrugged. "They're just being cautious." That conversation came back to me unexpectedly. I had no idea what those tests were for. None. But the memory stayed with me. Then an idea formed. Not a lie exactly. More like a question designed to uncover another truth. If David had been faithful, he'd laugh. If he'd betrayed me, guilt might do the talking before his mouth ever could. By the 15th day, I already knew enough. Not every detail, but enough. David came home just after 3 in the afternoon carrying airport coffee and duty-free chocolate like he was returning from the world's most innocent business trip. He kissed my cheek. "I missed you." "I missed you too," I answered. He started telling me about seminars and contractors he'd met. I barely heard a word. When he finally set his suitcase down, I looked directly into his eyes. "David." "What?" "Angela has HIV. His smile disappeared. I waited one heartbeat before asking the second sentence. "Did you know?" For one long second, neither of us moved. Then he whispered something I couldn't quite hear, grabbed his keys, ran to the garage, and disappeared. I stood alone in the kitchen listening to the engine roar down our quiet suburban street. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't crying. I was simply standing there realizing that sometimes the truth doesn't arrive through a confession. Sometimes it shows itself in pure panic. David didn't come home until almost 9 that night. I heard the garage door then, the slow shuffle of his shoes across the mudroom tile. Usually after a trip he'd walk straight into the kitchen looking for whatever I'd cooked. This time he barely looked at me. "You eat?" I asked. "I'm not hungry." He headed upstairs. No hug. No explanation. No, where did that come from? Just silence. That silence told me almost as much as his sprint to the urgent care clinic. I had made meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans. It sat untouched on the stove while I wrapped leftovers into plastic containers I knew we'd probably never eat. When I finally went upstairs, the bedroom door was closed. David had moved into the guest room. I stood outside for a second before knocking. "You okay?" "I'm just tired." "You've barely said 5 words." "I said I'm tired. That wasn't my husband. Not the man who usually couldn't stop talking about job sites and subcontractors. Not the man who'd complain for 20 minutes because somebody poured concrete before checking the weather forecast. This man sounded like someone waiting for bad news. The next morning I left for work before he woke up. Or maybe he never slept. When I pulled into the parking lot at Creekside Middle School, I realized I'd driven the entire way without turning on the radio. Mrs. Henderson, the 8th grade English teacher, noticed immediately. "You okay, Rebecca?" I smiled automatically. "Just didn't sleep much." She nodded. "Those summer curriculum meetings wear everybody out." I almost laughed. If only lesson plans had been my biggest problem. The school library was quiet during summer break except for teachers organizing classrooms and custodians waxing floors. Normally I loved those peaceful mornings. That day, every empty chair reminded me that my entire life suddenly felt unfamiliar. Around lunchtime, David finally texted, "Busy today, talk tonight." Nothing about where he'd gone. Nothing about the doctor. Nothing about Angela. I stared at the message for a full minute before typing back. Okay. Nothing else. If he wanted to lie, I wasn't going to help him. That evening, he spent almost an hour outside talking on his phone. The kitchen window overlooked our backyard, and I could see him pacing beside the fence. Every few minutes, he'd lower his voice. Then he'd glance toward the house. When he came inside, I asked casually, "Who was that?" "Work. At 8:30. West Coast contractor." He didn't even hesitate. That bothered me more than if he'd stumbled over the answer. People who practice lying stop sounding nervous. Over the next 4 days, those phone calls became routine. Always outside. Always after dinner. Always ending the same way. He'd walk back inside looking exhausted. Sometimes he'd immediately shower. Sometimes he'd sit alone in the basement pretending to watch television. We barely spoke. Our marriage had become 2 strangers politely sharing the same address. By Friday afternoon, I admitted something to myself I'd been trying to avoid. I couldn't untangle this alone. I needed facts, not guesses. Not assumptions, facts. That afternoon, I drove to Indianapolis and parked outside a private investigation firm near Keystone Avenue. I almost turned around 3 separate times. Hiring a private investigator felt like crossing a line. like admitting my marriage might already be over. A woman in her 60s opened the office door. "You, Rebecca?" I nodded. "I'm Sharon Ellis." She'd spent 25 years with the Indiana State Police before opening her own agency. She wore no flashy jewelry, no dramatic detective trench coat, just khakis, sensible shoes, and reading glasses hanging from a cord around her neck. "Coffee?" she asked. "Please." She listened without interrupting while I explained everything. The Arizona trip, the photographs, the panic after my question. When I finished, she folded her hands. "What exactly do you want?" The question surprised me. I guess I want proof." She nodded. "No." I blinked. "No. You want certainty." She smiled kindly. "There's a difference." She was right. By the time I left her office, we'd agreed she'd begin immediately. Not because I wanted revenge. At least that's what I kept telling myself. Because I needed the truth before making decisions that would affect the rest of my life. 3 days later, Sharon called. "Can you come by?" Her voice revealed nothing. I drove straight there. She laid several photographs across the conference table. Hotel lobby, swimming pool, restaurant patio. There was David. There was Angela, holding hands, laughing, kissing outside the resort entrance. Even after preparing myself, seeing those pictures felt like someone pressing all the air out of my lungs. "I know," Sharon said quietly. "I kept hoping." She nodded. "They weren't what you thought." I couldn't finish the sentence. She slid over another folder. "There's more." Hotel invoices showed a single king room. Restaurant receipts for candlelit dinners. Spa reservations for couples massages. Car rental agreements. Security camera timestamps. Every document fit together like puzzle pieces. The affair wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was a timeline. I looked away from the photographs. "I've seen enough." "No," Sharon answered gently. "I don't think you have." She opened another folder. "This isn't just about cheating." Inside were bank statements. At first they looked ordinary. Then she pointed to several transfers. $2,000, $3,500, $200. Money had quietly moved from David's paycheck into another checking account over nearly 11 months. "How much?" I asked. "Just under $64,000? I stared at her. "I never noticed." "Most spouses don't." She wasn't judging me, just stating a fact. Whose account? Only his name. That hurt almost more than the affair. The planning. The patience. The secrecy. This wasn't one mistake. It was a second life. Driving home, I cried harder than I had in years. Not dramatic sobbing. Just quiet tears that kept surprising me every time I stopped at a red light. That evening, David asked if I'd made coffee. Coffee? After everything. I handed him a mug. He thanked me. We stood in the same kitchen where we'd once danced while waiting for brownies to bake. Now we discussed weather forecasts. Garbage pickup. Whether the lawn needed mowing. Anything except the enormous lie sitting between us. Part of me wanted to scream. Another part wanted him to confess on his own. Instead, I waited. Because every day he stayed silent, he was making his own choices. And choices have consequences. 2 mornings later, Sharon called again. This one surprised me. "What is it?" "I think you should come in." I arrived 20 minutes later. She closed the office door. I recovered deleted emails between David and Angela. Vacation planning. Apartment listings. Furniture shopping. Then one message stopped me cold. "Once Rebecca agrees to sell the house, we'll finally have enough money to start over together." Another. "She trusts both of us. She'll never see it coming." The room suddenly felt smaller. They hadn't planned to simply continue an affair. They were waiting for me to help finance their new life. Our house. The place where we'd spent 18 Christmas mornings. The kitchen we'd remodeled together. The maple tree David planted for our 10th anniversary. He wanted me to sell it willingly, then disappear with my best friend. I looked up at Sharon. I thought discovering the affair was the worst part. She shook her head slowly. "No." So did I. For 2 days after Sharon showed me those emails, I couldn't bring myself to look at David for more than a few seconds at a time. It wasn't anger anymore. Anger burns hot. This was something colder. I was grieving a marriage that apparently had ended long before I'd realized it. David kept pretending everything was normal. He left for work every morning around 6:30 with his travel mug full of coffee. He texted around lunchtime. He came home just after 5. If someone had watched us from across the street, they probably would have thought we were an ordinary middle-aged couple settling into another Indiana summer. Inside the house, we were strangers acting out familiar routines. One evening he asked, "You want Chinese tonight?" I looked up from the dishwasher. "Sure." He ordered from the same little place we'd been using for years. Orange chicken for him. Vegetable lo mein for me. The delivery driver smiled like always. David even thanked him. Watching him behave so normally after everything I'd learned almost made me dizzy. How does someone carry that much deception and still remember to ask if you need more soy sauce? The next morning I made a decision. I'd spent enough time trying to understand David. Now I wanted to hear Angela's side. Not because I expected honesty. Because I wanted to know whether she had any idea I'd uncovered their plans. I called her around 10. She answered on the second ring. Rebecca. She sounded surprised. Can we meet? A long pause. What about? I think you know. Silence again. Finally she sighed. Rosie's place. Noon. I'll be there. I arrived 15 minutes early. The little cafe looked exactly the way it always had. Fresh muffins in the display case. Classic rock playing softly through ceiling speakers. Retired couples drinking coffee while discussing grandchildren and golf scores. Angela walked in wearing oversized sunglasses despite the cloudy weather. She looked thinner than I remembered. More tired. She sat down without hugging me. Neither of us reached for a menu. I suppose you know, she said quietly. I know enough. She laughed bitterly. Then congratulations. Congratulations. You won. I stared at her. This isn't a game. It was to David. Those words landed harder than I expected. The waitress brought coffee. Neither of us touched it. Angela folded her arms. He's not answering my calls anymore. I didn't respond. I quit my job. That caught my attention. What? He told me we'd be moving. My stomach tightened. Exactly what Sharon had found. Only now I was hearing it from Angela herself. I gave notice 3 weeks ago. You quit your job. He said we'd start fresh. She shook her head slowly. I was stupid. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then I remembered 18 years of friendship. Birthday dinners. Road trips. Late-night phone calls after my mother died. She hadn't just betrayed my marriage. She'd betrayed decades of trust. You had choices too, Angela. I know. You could have walked away. I know. You could have told me. She looked down at the untouched coffee. I know. For the first time since this nightmare began, neither of us argued. There wasn't much left to argue about. We both knew who we'd become. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me since David raced to the doctor. Did you ever tell David you had HIV? She frowned. What? HIV. Her forehead wrinkled. Where would you even get that? I asked him if he knew. Angela blinked twice. Then she started laughing. Not happy laughter. The kind that comes when your brain can't quite process what's happening. Oh my God. What? I don't have HIV. I know. She stopped laughing. You knew. I didn't know anything. She leaned back. Then why would you ask him that? I took a slow breath. Months ago you mentioned your doctor wanted more blood work. She nodded. Yeah, I remembered. Angela shook her head. Rebecca, they thought I might have an autoimmune disorder. What? My doctor ordered extra testing because my white blood cell count was unusual. She paused. Everything came back normal. I stared at her. So? I've never had HIV. I didn't know. I can see that. For the first time all afternoon I smiled. Not because anything was funny. Because suddenly David's reaction became even more revealing. Angela looked at me carefully. You bluffed. I asked a question. And he believed it. He sure did. She covered her mouth. Oh, wow. We sat there in silence while the realization settled over both of us. David never stopped to ask whether my statement was true. He never demanded an explanation. He never said, that's impossible. He ran. Because guilt had answered before logic ever had the chance. Angela slowly shook her head. I thought he loved me. I looked directly at her. I thought he loved me too. That was the only thing we agreed on. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. I should probably show you something. She opened a photo album. Vacation pictures. The Grand Canyon. Scottsdale restaurants. A desert jeep tour. Then videos. David laughing. David telling jokes. David promising, this is the beginning of our real life. Angela stopped on one video. He was sitting beside a hotel pool. I can't wait until Rebecca finally agrees to sell that house. He raised a plastic cup. To new beginnings? Angela closed the phone. I watched that video every night. And now, I can't stand hearing his voice. Neither could I. Before we left, Angela said something unexpected. I deserve whatever people think about me. I didn't answer. But David doesn't deserve another chance to lie. What are you saying? If you're planning to expose him, she swallowed hard. I'll tell the truth. I searched her face. There was regret there. Real regret. Not enough to erase what she'd done. Nothing could erase that. But enough to make me believe she was finally done protecting him. Driving home, I kept replaying the conversation. Part of me wondered whether I should simply file for divorce and disappear quietly. No public confrontation. No revenge. Just leave. Life would certainly be easier. But every time I imagined that I remembered the emails. She trusts both of us. She'll never see it coming. They hadn't just cheated. They'd counted on my kindness. They'd planned to use it against me. That wasn't a marriage ending. That was a calculated betrayal. When I pulled into our driveway, David was mowing the lawn. He waved. Like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't spent months planning another life. He shut off the mower. You're home? Yep. You okay? I've actually never been clearer. He smiled, misunderstanding completely. I'm glad. As I walked past him toward the front door, I realized something. For weeks I'd been reacting to his choices. That ended today. Now I had my own plan. And for the first time since he boarded that flight to Arizona, I wasn't afraid anymore. By the time the 4th of July rolled around, I'd made my decision. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to throw his clothes onto the front lawn or key his truck or post vague messages on Facebook. That wasn't me. If the truth was going to come out, it would come out the same way I'd uncovered it. Quietly. Clearly. With facts. David's parents hosted the family cookout every Independence Day at their home in Fishers, just northeast of Indianapolis. It had become a tradition long before I married into the family. His father, Richard, took grilling as seriously as some people took religion. His mother, Elaine, always made 3 different potato salads because she insisted everyone had a favorite. By noon, cousins were setting up lawn chairs. Kids chased each other with water balloons. Someone had country music playing through an old Bluetooth speaker. If you didn't know any better, you'd think it was the perfect American family gathering. David acted like his old self. He laughed with his younger brother, Mark. He helped Richard carry coolers across the backyard. He kissed me lightly on the cheek in front of everyone. Want a burger? He asked. I'm fine. You sure? I'm sure. He smiled and walked away. Watching him perform the role of devoted husband almost impressed me. Almost. Around 1 o'clock, Sharon Ellis arrived. She wasn't invited as a guest. She came because I'd asked if she'd be willing to drop off the original documents I'd need. She wore jeans and a navy polo shirt, looking more like someone's aunt than a retired investigator. She handed me a plain manila envelope. Everything's organized. Thank you. She hesitated. You don't have to do this publicly. I know. There's still time to walk away. I've thought about that every day. She squeezed my shoulder. Whatever happens, make sure you're doing it for yourself. Not for revenge. Not for humiliation. For myself. I nodded. I am. She left before anyone paid much attention. I slipped the envelope into my tote bag. For the next hour, I questioned my own plan. Maybe I should wait. Maybe I should confront David privately. Maybe exposing everything in front of his family would only make me look bitter. Every few minutes, I'd decide not to do it. Then I'd remember another email. Another lie. Another month, he'd secretly moved money into an account I didn't know existed. By 3 o'clock, everyone gathered under the big maple tree for dessert. Richard stood up holding a paper plate. I just want to say how grateful I am. The usual family speech. Good health. Good food. Good company. Then he smiled at me. Rebecca, thanks for bringing those brownies. You always make the best ones. I smiled back. You're welcome. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. When everyone finished clapping, I stood. I'd actually like to say something too. David looked pleasantly surprised. Go ahead. Every face turned toward me. I took one slow breath. 18 years ago, I married into this family. Elaine smiled warmly. You all welcomed me. Several people nodded. I've always appreciated that. David slipped his arm around my waist. I gently stepped away. His smile faded just a little. I also believe families deserve honesty. The backyard grew noticeably quieter. David looked at me. What are you doing? I ignored him. I've recently learned that my husband spent 15 days in Arizona with my best friend. Someone dropped a plastic fork. Elaine frowned. What? David laughed nervously. Rebecca. I opened the envelope. I'm not asking anyone to take my word for it. I held up photographs. Hotel lobby. Pool. Restaurant. David's face went completely blank. I have hotel records. More papers. I have receipts. Another stack. I have photographs. Silence. The children had stopped playing. Even the music seemed too loud. David finally stepped forward. This isn't what it looks like. I looked directly at him. Then tell everyone what it looks like. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I continued. You told me you were attending a construction conference. I was. For 15 days, there were meetings. I held up another document. The resort confirmed there wasn't a conference scheduled there. His shoulders sagged slightly. Richard stared at his son. David, I can explain. I nodded. I hope you can. Then I asked the question I'd been saving. The day you came home, I asked whether Angela had HIV. Every eye shifted toward David. I kept my voice calm. Why did you run straight to a doctor if nothing happened? Complete silence. David looked around the yard as though searching for an escape. Finally, he said quietly, because... He stopped. Richard spoke first. Answer your wife. David couldn't. Not because he didn't understand. Because there wasn't an innocent explanation. His panic had already answered weeks earlier. Elaine sat down heavily. Oh, David. He rubbed both hands across his face. I made a mistake. I shook my head. No. What? A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. I held up the bank statements. This took almost a year. Gasps spread through the family. Mark picked up one of the papers. What account is this? David reached for it. Give me that. Mark pulled it away. You moved $64,000? Nobody said a word. I spoke quietly. You were planning to convince me to sell our house. David stared at the ground. So you could leave with Angela. Richard looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 seconds. Tell me she's wrong. David remained silent. At that exact moment, another car pulled into the driveway. Heads turned. Angela climbed out. Several relatives recognized her immediately. She walked slowly toward the backyard, carrying nothing but her purse. David whispered, no. She ignored him. When she reached the patio, she looked directly at Elaine. I'm sorry. Then at Richard. I'm sorry. Finally, she looked at me. I lied to all of you. David stepped forward. Angela, don't. She raised a hand. No. Her voice trembled. I'm done protecting you. She looked around at the family. The affair was real. No one moved. He promised we'd build a life together. She laughed bitterly. He promised a lot of things. David buried his face in his hands. Angela continued. The trip wasn't a conference. It was our vacation. I quit my job because he said we'd be moving together. Elaine began crying quietly. Richard stood perfectly still. Angela took one final breath, and Rebecca never lied to me. She turned toward me. The question about HIV, she looked back at everyone else. I don't have HIV. Confused expressions spread across the yard. Rebecca didn't know that. She gave a sad smile. She simply asked him a question. Richard slowly turned toward his son. And you believed it? David couldn't even look at him. That single realization seemed to hit everyone at once. No accusation. No test result. Just one question. And his own fear had exposed everything. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Finally, Richard walked over to me. I'm so sorry. I nodded. I know. Then he turned to David. You need to leave. Dad? Now. David looked around the backyard. Nobody defended him. Not one person. He picked up his truck keys from the patio table. As he walked past me, he stopped. I never wanted to hurt you. I met his eyes for what I knew would be the last time as his wife. That stopped being true a long time ago. He lowered his head. Then he walked away alone. The truck engine faded down the street. No one celebrated. There was no applause. Just a quiet family trying to absorb the truth. Standing there beneath the maple tree, I didn't feel victorious. I felt lighter. Sometimes justice doesn't sound like shouting. Sometimes it sounds like silence after the lies finally end. Exactly 1 week after David raced to the urgent care clinic, I sat across from a divorce attorney in downtown Carmel. Her office overlooked the Monon Trail. Cyclists and joggers passed beneath the windows while I signed papers that officially ended 18 years of marriage. Life has a strange way of moving forward, even when yours feels like it's standing still. The attorney Melissa Grant adjusted her glasses and slid another document toward me. Rebecca, because there are no children involved, this should move more quickly than most divorce cases. I nodded. I'd still like everything handled fairly. She smiled gently. That's usually easier to say than to do. I know. What are you hoping for? I thought about it for a moment. I don't want revenge anymore. She looked up. I just don't want to be taken advantage of again. She smiled. That's a healthy place to begin. Those words stayed with me for weeks. David was served the divorce papers that Friday afternoon. He didn't call. He didn't text. His attorney contacted mine 3 days later. That was it. After nearly 2 decades together, our conversations had been replaced by legal letters and scheduled meetings. It felt cold. But somehow it also felt peaceful. 3 days after the cookout, David received the results from his medical tests. Negative. Every test. By then it no longer mattered. He wasn't relieved. At least that's what Mark later told me. Apparently David sat in his truck outside the clinic for nearly an hour without starting the engine. Not because he was sick, because he finally understood what he'd lost. The fear that had sent him running to the doctor had disappeared. The consequences hadn't. Word spread faster than I expected. Not because I posted anything online. I never did. Families talk. Neighbors notice. Someone always knows someone. Within 2 weeks, people around Carmel had pieced together enough of the story. I never corrected anyone. I never added details. I simply lived my life. Angela reached out once. She mailed me a handwritten letter. Not an email. Not a text. A real letter. I recognized her handwriting immediately. For almost an hour, I stared at the envelope without opening it. When I finally did, there weren't any excuses. No blaming David. No asking for forgiveness. Just a simple apology. She admitted she'd confused excitement with love. She admitted she'd convinced herself I would somehow recover. She admitted she hadn't thought about what 18 years of friendship actually meant until she'd destroyed it. At the bottom, she wrote one sentence that stayed with me. I became someone I never thought I could be. I folded the letter, placed it back into the envelope, and put it inside a kitchen drawer. Not because I wanted to save it forever, because I wasn't ready to throw away part of my life just yet. Forgiveness and reconciliation aren't the same thing. Some bridges remain broken even after anger fades. David moved into a furnished apartment in Indianapolis. Mark told me it was small. 1 bedroom, 2nd floor, no garage. For the first time in years, David had to cook for himself. Apparently, he'd burned a frozen pizza so badly the smoke alarm brought half the building into the hallway. When Mark told me that over coffee, I couldn't help laughing. I shouldn't find that funny, I said. You probably shouldn't, he smiled. But I knew you would. It wasn't the pizza. It was the image of a man who once believed he had everything carefully planned, suddenly discovering that real life doesn't follow secret agendas. Mark sighed. I miss my brother. I know, but I don't recognize him anymore. Neither did I. The divorce process wasn't easy. There were meetings, appraisals, bank statements. The hidden checking account became a major issue. David's attorney tried arguing that the money came entirely from his income. Melissa calmly pointed out that Indiana considers many assets acquired during marriage to be marital property. The judge wasn't impressed by months of secret transfers. In the end, the settlement was fair. Not perfect. Fair. That was enough. The hardest day wasn't signing the divorce decree. It was taking my wedding ring off. I sat alone in my bedroom. The house was completely quiet. For almost 20 minutes, I simply stared at my left hand. That ring had been there so long it almost felt like part of me. When I finally slipped it off, the pale band of skin underneath surprised me. Some marks don't disappear overnight. Neither do emotional ones. I placed the ring inside a small wooden box beside photographs of my parents. Then I closed the lid. I never opened it again. Summer slowly became autumn. The maple tree in the backyard turned bright orange. The evenings grew cooler. Life, little by little, began to feel recognizable again. I started volunteering twice a week at the Hamilton East Public Library. It reminded me why I'd become a librarian in the first place. People came looking for stories. Sometimes they left carrying hope. Sometimes just a mystery novel. Either way, they walked out a little lighter. Linda, my neighbor, finally asked the question everyone had politely avoided. You okay? I looked across the fence. You know. She nodded. I know. I wasn't for a while. And now, I smiled. I think I'm becoming okay. She smiled back. That's enough. It was. Around October, another librarian invited me to join a Saturday morning hiking group at Eagle Creek Park. The first hike nearly wore me out. I hadn't realized how out of shape I'd become. Halfway through the trail, an older gentleman laughed and handed me a bottle of water. First time, is it that obvious? You'll be back. He was right. By November, I looked forward to those hikes every weekend. Fresh air, new conversations, people who knew nothing about my past, people who only knew the woman walking beside them. That felt surprisingly freeing. One evening, as I sat on my back porch watching leaves drift across the yard, I thought about the question that had changed everything. She has HIV, did you know? It wasn't the question itself that ended my marriage. It wasn't even the panic that followed. The marriage had already been falling apart beneath secrets I couldn't yet see. That moment simply pulled away the last curtain. Looking back now, I don't feel proud that David was frightened. Fear isn't justice. Truth is, his own choices exposed him long before I ever did. People sometimes ask whether I regret confronting him in front of his family. The honest answer is no. Not because it embarrassed him, because they deserved the truth as much as I did. No more lies, no more pretending. Just the facts. I've learned something through all of this. Trust isn't destroyed in one dramatic moment. It disappears quietly, one hidden decision at a time. And rebuilding your life doesn't happen in one dramatic victory either. It happens the same way, one honest day at a time. If you've stayed with me until the end of this story, thank you for listening. If you've ever had to rebuild after betrayal, I hope you remember that someone else's dishonesty never defines your worth. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, I'd be grateful if you subscribed, left a comment, or shared your own experience.